Please forgive my voice. I'm not in the best of health today. It's a great pleasure to be here. I feel a bit out of place in that to talk about race in the context of a discussion of religious pluralism is already a connection that perhaps is a bit tenuous. It's not tenuous to think of race in terms of pluralism, of course, and race has been, in so many ways, a foundational dimension of not only the creation and development of the United States, but on a world scale, a fundamental dimension of the transition to modernity. And so in that way, I suppose I'm not quite the ringer I was imagining myself to be. We often think of race as something innate and biologically given and naturally structured. Of course, it's not. And in fact, it's a modern concept that really, in many ways, did not exist before the onset of modernity, before the circumnavigation of the globe, before the rise of Europe, before the encounter, the transatlantic encounter, that is Europe and the Americas. The relationship between Europe and Africa and Europe and Asia is, of course, quite different, were, of course, and remain quite different from the relationship between Europe and the Americas. It's interesting to think that, to remember that Europe was, a part of Europe was ruled by Africa, by the so-called Moors, by the Maghreb, thinking, of course, of the Iberian Peninsula, for something like half a millennium, maybe a bit more, so that there was a very strong familiarity in Spain and Portugal, notably, with Africa. And it's not just North Africa, the Arab world, but also sub-Saharan Africa, which had entered Europe. So when, through the Iberian connection, let's say, so that when the first encounters with the Americas happened, and they, of course, happened with Portugal and Spain in the lead, not England, not France, not Holland, not Denmark or the other more northern European countries. The presence of Africa was already there, and the recognition of a certain otherness that came through the Europe-Africa connection also structured our understanding of race in more complicated ways than we in North America tend to recognize or remember. But to understand what race is, it's important to recognize that it is, though it appears to be a natural, as I say, a natural and biological and so on phenomenon, it is not. It's become a sort of a truism that race is a social construct. That is, it's a way, it's a concept which explains different interests, which links different interests and different socio-political positions to different types of human bodies. And that's peculiar, folks. Let's recognize that it is. It's not a particularly logical thing, especially from our contemporary viewpoint. It's very, we've become very familiar with this peculiarity or irregularity of the attribution of interest on the part of body type. At the same time, it's something that has been so deeply embedded in our understanding of who we are, of what human identity is about, and what national, social, cultural identities are about, political identities, that it's quite impossible to dispense with. It's useful to think of the original or nearly original encounters of the modern world as shaping that association, types of bodies and particular interests. When the Americas were settled, were conquered, when settler colonialism began, it was very important to be able to distinguish, and to distinguish on an immediate basis, who was a settler and who a native. A kind of ocularity, a kind of opticality, a phenomic, corporeal connection had to be made as a practical matter. This is something that could be called the social construction of race. And why? Not because we understood, or the original settlers or the original natives understood race to be a concept in the way we're talking about it now, but simply as a practical matter to organize domination, and then also reciprocally and necessarily to organize resistance. We need to be able to see who's who. This initially was a settler native matter, but it soon became a freedom and enslavement matter as well. Who is a free person? Who is a slave? Who is a person? Who is chattel? Who has rights, requires, demands, is entitled to respect, and has, as the Supreme Court said as late as 1857, no rights which others, that is whites, are bound to respect. That was the famous Dred Scott case. So that distinction, again, as a practical matter, long before we have any theory of race, any biological concerns, any religious concerns, any sociological, political, economic concerns, but simply as a matter of organizing power and resisting power. That's the origin, the real origin, I would argue, of the social construction of race. It's only later, after settler rule, after slavocratic rule, after imperial interests have divided up the world, comprehensively pretty much, maybe not entirely, only then do we get theories of race, the rise of social Darwinism, for example, Well, and before that, of course, religious theories, the curse of Ham, and so on. But these matters, the curse of Ham was not on the minds of the Spanish colonialists or the British colonialists or the French colonialists. That came later. So that's something that we can say about race. A concept which is used, that's a good definition, a concept which is used to distinguish particular types of human bodies along the lines of political and economic interests, socio-political and economic interests. Now, in contrast to that, Vince asked me to say something about what is ethnicity, and it's always striking to me that, especially in the United States, but not only in the United States, these words are synonymized. That is the ethnic concept, the ethnicity concept can be used and is very frequently used as an equivalent to the race concept, but it's really quite different. Ethnicity is a matter of culture. It's much more fungible than race is. Ethnicity is about your religion, your language, your cuisine, perhaps your national origin, your dress. It can be changed. It can change in ways that race cannot. You can immigrate, lose your national origin. You can convert your religion. You can learn another language. You can stop eating what you were used to eating and start eating something quite different. Now, of course, this brings the body back in a peculiar way. Is the body something that you really cannot change? I think in a general way, yes. If you are marked on your body as a part of a particular race, then in general, you are going to remain part of that race. But again, ethnicity and race do, we have to admit, overlap in certain ways. The overlap would be that, yes, it is possible to change your race. It has been possible, at least a little bit. Different, at least in terms of the experiential level, people have passed, people have concealed their racial identities. And on a more comprehensive level, the meanings of race have changed, and the assignment of raciality to different groups has changed. So that Jews were a race in Nazi Germany. They have sort of ceased to be a race now. Jews were a race in the United States. The Irish were a race. They've become an ethnicity, an ethnic group. It's quite interesting that I say one category, ethnicity is fungible and one race is not, but that's really not quite true, is it? Because race is a social construct. It can move, it can change over time. Ethnic groups can be racialized. Racial groups can be deracialized. That has happened, that is happening. There's an instability that's fundamental. I want to say one thing about racism, which Vince didn't ask me to talk about. In the United States particularly, but again, I think we are just a case, albeit a big case, of a world historical phenomenon. In the United States, race is so fundamental to our identities, collective as well as individual, that racism becomes a fundamental marker, a key marker of how we see ourselves and each other. None of us are exempt from it. In sociological literature, we've reached a place, I'm not sure if this is the final place, where racism is broken down, has been broken down into three generally separate but also overlapping dimensions. One dimension, the one most familiar to all of us, is the dimension of beliefs and attitudes. Sort of mental constructs, the way we see other people as racialized, and our beliefs in about the nature of racial difference. This generally involves questions of superiority, inferiority, attribution of particular characteristics to individuals, such familiar phenomena as stereotyping, xenophobia, that sort of thing. Second area is what we generally call discrimination, but I would change that a little bit to say, if prejudice is one area, ideas and beliefs, discrimination is a second area, but it's really about actions, and therefore it's not just treating people differently, allocating resources positively or negatively along the lines of race, but also actions of different types. For example, violence, the use of violence along racial lines, lynching, race riots, that sort of thing. A third area of racism that we've talked about that we want to include in this is structural. And that is, when we're talking about structural racism, we're talking about the accumulation, the cumulative qualities of race, of racism, rather that what happens in the exercise of racism builds up. It's not lost. If you are jailed, that has consequences certainly for the rest of your life. If you're incarcerated, you have great difficulties when you come out of jail and so on and so forth. But those consequences will also apply to your children and maybe your grandchildren and so on. It makes it much more difficult for your children to have a free or equal life if their parent was incarcerated. If you receive an unequal education, that will, because of racial segregation, let's say, in education, that will have consequences for you for your whole life and will be passed on to your children as well, because they will have certain disadvantages that came from the disadvantages that you have. And think about this as accumulating over generations. Think about it in terms of wealth distribution along racial lines, for example, accumulating over generations, and institutionalizing a certain structuring into society, a certain fundamental or seemingly almost fundamental inequality. So those three areas, prejudice, discrimination, structural accumulative racism, are the key dimensions of that concept. I will stop.